John Hughes is the chief historian for the Office of the Secretary of State and their Legacy Washington program. And his office is right here in Tumwater, by the way, in the building that houses the State Library. So he's a local guy, or he is now anyway. John retired as an editor and publisher of the Daily World in Aberdeen in 2008, after a 43-year career as editor in journalism that saw him win awards for reporting and photography and historical features, editorials, and columns. He's an alumnus of the University of Puget Sound and the University of Maryland, and he's a trustee of the Washington State Historical Society. And I first took note of his work when I came across one of his 11 books on Northwest history, and that was titled On the Harbor from Black Friday to Nirvana, about Grace Harbor County, really. And boy, I just fell in love with his writing style, and I'm glad to have him here. Among his books is one called Booth Who, and that is about Booth Gardner. And his latest book is 1968, The Year That Rocked Washington, and I think he'll talk about here during his presentation here today. But he's researched and interviewed many well-known personalities of the 20th century Washington history, and many of which he'll be highlighting for us today in his presentation, The Art of Oral History. So let me have us all join together and welcome John Hughes.
Well, thank you, Don. It's terrifying and gratifying to see such a packed house. I remember a year ago I gave a talk on a rainy Thursday night at the Hoquiam Timberland Library that I thought had been really well publicized, and 2 people showed up. But they turned out to be 2 of the most interesting people I'd ever met. So we talked about the book, and we repaired to Hoquiam's new brewery and had a wonderful time. And I think that it would be great here at the Olympia Brewery, the Schmidt House, to have a little oldie beer too. In the audience today are 2 of the finest newspapermen I ever worked with in my 43-year career in journalism. I got to work with both at the Daily World in Aberdeen. In fact, John Dodge, who worked for me for 10 years, worked for us for 10 years, then went home to Olympia, did landmark work in coverage of the Washington Public Power Supply System debacle, and retired recently and has a terrific new book about the Columbus Day storm. You should buy it. It's really well done. Also, Bill Lindstrom, former city editor of the Daily World, now living in Olympia, has a book on the history of newspapering on the Olympic Peninsula called Straight Press. That's hard on the heels of his book about the legendary John Torno, Wild Man of the Oxbow. It's a nonfiction novel that separates the man from the myth, and Bill just did a magnificent job of using actual dialogue from newspaper accounts, court testimony to fabricate a real classic in the genre. Bill's friend Sandy Kroll has a book coming out soon called help me, Sandy, what is it called? I can't read my own writing. Water, Woods, and Prairies, about the history of Thurston County, coming soon from Gorham Printing, one of the top small volume publishing houses in America in Lewis County.
And also, Don Trosper and Karen Johnson are part of that too.
Fabulous, fabulous. Well, the rich history of Thurston County, since getting to work here at the State Library in the past 10 years, getting to talk at Schmidt House, been a real treat, not to mention service on the Washington State Historical Society. I give you a preview of coming events that you won't want to miss, because on February 7th here at the Schmidt House, Professor Quintard Taylor, retired from the University of Washington and one of the leading black history scholars in America, with his friend Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., is going to be talking about the pioneering Lewis County settler, Mr. Bush, and you won't want to miss that. George Bush the first, our own. Well, let me tell you about the Legacy Project. I got an offer 10 years ago, proverbially, that I couldn't refuse from Sam Reed. My wife likes to say that timing's everything. Circulation of the Daily World was up. We were ahead of budget, and Sam Reed approached me and offered me a job to be chief historian for a brand new project called the Legacy Project. It took me about 24 hours to accept. In hindsight and in prescience, it was a pretty good decision, because for those of us who spent so many years doing journalism, it's heartbreaking to see what's happened to our newspapers, the Daily World, the Olympian, the Port Angeles Daily News. Thank God for the Blethen family in Seattle and the Seattle Times, pouring every cent of its money and a lot of money from philanthropic organizations that value high-quality investigative journalism to keep it going as one of the few family-owned newspapers left in America. Well, let me tell you about the Legacy Project. Lori Larson, who's here in the front row, a terrific historian. Lori, stand up. This is Lori, who's the chief researcher. Lori and I are the charter members of the Legacy Project in the fall of 2008. In fact, I think I got the job because they sent her to interview me to see if she would really like to work with an old fart like me. And it turned out pretty well. She's just an amazing historian. Last year, we hired Bob Young, who was on 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams for the Seattle Times, and earlier at the Willamette Week in Portland, to join us as a historian when our teammate Trova Heffernan was promoted to a division director in the agency. Laura Mott and Amber Rainey are oversee fundraising for the Legacy Project and exhibit design, and also educational outreach. In the past several years, we've really tried to make Washington State history more meaningful for 8th graders who take an obligatory Washington State history class. It broke my heart when my daughters came home from Washington State history the first week and told me how boring it was, because as the people in this room know, Washington State history is anything but boring. And I think we're to the point now where Washington State history classes are no longer the province of the old volleyball coach, with all due respect to the old volleyball coach. Also, Laura and Amber work with a really remarkable program of the Office of the Secretary of State, and that is the Talking Book and Braille Library, also known as Watauble. And what a tremendous outreach it does. It's a national award-winning program. The latest exhibit by our team is on display now at the Secretary of State's office in the state capitol. It focuses on 1968, the year that rocked the world, and what a tumultuous year it was, with Vietnam, assassinations, tragedies and triumphs, ending with the astronauts orbiting the moon and reading from the book of Genesis after all the bloodshed and turmoil. There's also a book that accompanies the 1968 project. We do not use state funds to publish printed books. All the stories in this book are available free online, but the printed book is done with funds that are raised through the Washington State Heritage Trust independently. Limited edition. It's really a terrific book. If you buy it, it will help. We can print more books. We also did books on the Korean War and on World War II. Korea is the forgotten war remembered, and that was really an amazingly successful project, because the Korean consulate in Seattle saw the quality of what we were doing and helped us with fundraising. The stories that emerged from that are just remarkable. So too the stories in this 1968 project. Some of them include Ralph Munro, our former longtime Secretary of State, who was, as a young man in the staff of Governor Dan Evans, an absolute remarkable disability rights advocate, helped pass landmark legislation, curb pathways for handicapped people, handicapped bathroom stalls and all the like, are the handiwork of Ralph and his amazing humanitarian spirit. Legendary, one of the really fun ones we got to do was with legendary KJR disc jockey Pat O'Day. And if you're from my era, the Pat O'Day and KJR, Seattle, Channel 95, was the soundtrack of our lives. And what a hoot he was. Former Congressman Norm Dix was in law school at the University of Washington in 1968, in the middle of all that, and upon graduation was hired as an aide to Senator Warren Magnuson, and the rest's history. Former State Senator Karen Frazier, who has probably done more to advance the cause of women in our state in the modern era than any other person, gave a wonderful talk here not long ago on her half-century in Olympia. And one of the ones that really resonated with us, no story about 1968 would be complete without a Vietnam veteran. We found an extraordinary one, a man named Brian Laux, who is a retired Weyerhaeuser forester in Lewis County. People are nodding because he's amazing. Brian, like a lot of Vietnam veterans, at first didn't want to talk about it. We won his confidence, and the story that we shared in the 1968 project is actually largely a memoir that he wrote and I helped him with. It tells the story of his mentor when he was a medic, a Green Beret medic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail doing clandestine work, interdicting supply lines. His mentor was a man named John Keddenberg from New York, actually younger than Brian, but had been in a Green Beret longer and taught Brian how to stay alive in the jungle, the whole lore of that. It has a terribly tragic ending in that Keddenberg was killed in a firefight just as he was surrendering his seat on a rescue helicopter to an indigenous member of his team. Brian was one of those who went in to retrieve his friend's body, and Keddenberg received the Medal of Honor for his valor. Greater love hath no man. So also, a really remarkable story that Lori told is of Dr. Maxine Mims, a bigger-than-life civil rights lady who, on the hilltop in Tacoma, helped establish the Evergreen State College's Tacoma campus. Dr. Mims is, 90 years old now? 91, and she's a force of nature. So it's been a busy 10 and a half past years. We've produced 14 books, 9 exhibits, and done 37 oral history profiles. It really is a labor of love, I'll tell you. First of all, it's amazing to get to work for the Office of the Secretary of State. Under Sam Reed and now Kim Wyman, this is an agency where year in and year out, when they do an annual survey of employee attitudes, you will find that people work hard and well and absolutely love what they do, from the state archives to elections to corporations. It's amazing. The biographies that we've done in the past 10 and a half years really turned out to be sort of landmarks in the field of Washington State history. Our mandate 10 years ago when we started was to do oral histories of former statewide elected officials, former members of Congress, former members of the judiciary, and then Sam Hunt and Sam Reed wrote a wonderful line into the statute for this program. They said, and other people from all walks of life who have made an indelible contribution to the political history of Washington State. So that means that with all due respect to former congressmen and senators and governors and lieutenant governors, you could go out and find the likes of a person like Lillian Walker, a extraordinarily modest little Christian lady in Bremerton who arrived there from the industrial north at the height of World War II and found, unfortunately, a lot of unrepentant old racists had arrived there as well. She helped found, together with her husband, the chapter of the NAACP, and in 1950 was part of a plaintiff to a landmark suit against a Bremerton druggist who refused to serve little black and other children of color at his soda fountain. Nobody knew about her until Robin Hunt, a state appellate court judge, told us about her, and it turned out to be a really amazing book that's used in schools and libraries around the state. Booth Gardner was an amazing story because when I first started interviewing Booth early on with the Legacy Project, he was in the early stages of Parkinson's disease, and in fact had a really revolutionary procedure called deep brain surgery that involves sort of like a pacemaker with a lead to your brain that gives you what is that wonderful chemical that we have in our brains? The dopamine. Thank you. I'm looking at my friend, a new friend, a physician here. And so for the next 3 months, intensively, I interviewed Booth. He had this burst of clarity. He was his old, ebullient self. And then there was a lapse when he fractured his ankle. And when I got back to him 3 months later, he was already in a very precipitous and sad decline. And I thought, I came back and told Lori and Trova, my teammates, how fortunate we were, and it really italicizes what I'm going to leave you with today. A saying, my Uncle Marvin's favorite saying rather, that we're all burning daylight. You better seize the day. We also did Slade Gorton, Jolene Unsold, First Lady Nancy Evans, the inimitable Adele Ferguson, the first female member of the press corps in Olympia, Jennifer Dunn, Sid Snyder, Billy Frank Jr., and an analysis of the amazing Rossi Gregoire 2004 governor's race by Trova Heffernan, which boiled down to 133 votes. And a lot of us in this room remember that vividly. Well, producing that much work in the space of 10 years says a lot about the historians on our staff and at the State Library and the archives. A lot of us remember when the State Library was on the Capitol campus. It had a higher profile. It was more convenient. It was Sam Reed who saved the State Library from extinction by Governor Locke. And we're in a building in Tumwater that is adequate but not purpose-built, as we say. And one of our initiatives in this legislative session, meanwhile, I should say parenthetically, that the state archives are in a Cold War-era fallout shelter, desperately needing more room. And we're hoping that this is our year for a new purpose-built building to house the archives, the library, legacy, and other key offices in a new structure in Tumwater. So hope we have your support on that. Working at the State Library is a movable feast. I mean, every day there are trained librarians, crackerjack historians, and researchers who just love to help you do research. Genealogists are in there day after day looking at shifts manifests, maps, early oral histories, ephemera. It's remarkable. And practically every newspaper published in the state of Washington since territorial days is available on microfilm. Talk about a trove. We could not do the work we're doing with that. And now, moreover, we have high-tech computer panel, not just the clunky old microfilm readers that we're all so used to. And this is a priceless trove of books. I mean, and these search engines are remarkable. We have ProQuest, Genealogy Bank, Chronicling America, NewsLibrary.com, Washington Digital Newspapers. And the digital state archives your digital state archives are recognized internationally as a pace setter, just the envy of every other Secretary of State in the nation. Well, before I joined the Legacy Project in 2008, I spent 42 years in journalism, actually practically 43 as Don mentioned, and I retired as publisher and editor of the Daily World in Aberdeen. Last year, when we decided unanimously to hire Bob Young, another old newsie, as our newest team member, that was the first sentence of his resume that really got to us. And this is if you're looking for a job, you need a great lead. Bob wrote, "A confession, I'm a frustrated historian." I really couldn't put it any better than that, because John and Bill and I and others probably in this room who've done newspapering know that it really is the first rough draft of history. The downside is that you're always chasing a deadline, so you never have time, or rarely have time, to tell the rest of the story, which is so great for the work that Bill and John and I are getting to do now, to tell the story of the Columbus Day storm, to put a rich storyteller's history on pioneer newspapermen on the Olympic Peninsula and all the amazing characters that were there. I love being a newspaperman, especially in Grace Harbor. I mean, it's a gritty, colorful place filled with remarkable characters. There's a story on every corner. But my calling was always history. From my childhood, listening to my uncles, who were union organizers for the International Woodworkers of America, talk about strikes and the Depression and unsolved murders. It just was really gripping. When I arrived at the University of Puget Sound in 1962, it was my great good fortune to have Murray Morgan, to my mind, the greatest historian, at least to date, in the history of the Northwest, teaching a class on Northwest history. Murray's book, Skid Row, which came out in 1951, is still, if you haven't read it, reread it. It's absolutely mesmerizing for how a great storyteller can make history come alive. The clopping of the horses' hooves on the cobblestone streets of Seattle as they clambered after the Great Fire. I mean, it's just amazing. Well, luckily for me, growing up as I did next door to the people who owned the Aberdeen Daily World, when Murray discovered that, he told me that he'd been a reporter on Hoquiam's morning daily, the Grace Harbor Washingtonian, in the late 30s and 1940s, together with another great historian, George Sunborg, the father of Father Steve Sunborg at Seattle University. He told me that journalism was really the sport of kings, that you'd never make any money, but it was absolutely a fascinating life's calling. And he told me that he thought that I could write with flair, and that if I wanted to be a historian, which was my original intent, that I ought to become a newspaper man first. And the rest for me was really history. When I joined the staff of the Aberdeen Daily World in 1966, I got to cover everything from high school sports to the state legislature. I met old wobblies, shake rats, an unrepentant old communist who was still peddling the Daily Worker on street corners, and countless other amazing characters. One, and I need to write a book about, was retired Aberdeen Police Captain Nick Jansen, who in 1959 had the temerity to close down the best not-so-little whorehouse in Aberdeen without warning the mayor. And so when the mayor came to the police station on the cold morning after Nick's raid, Jansen's raid, he was stunned to find the foyer of the police station and police court filled with some of Aberdeen's leading citizens who had been pinched in Nellie Curtis's house together with the ladies of the night. It was amazing. For the record, as the editor of the Aberdeen High School Ocean Breeze, I had the temerity to write a editorial backing Captain Jansen in his raid, and the principal was not amused by that. He didn't think that was a fit topic. And the then editor of the Aberdeen Daily World, the late Edwin Van Sickle, came to my rescue and said that the kid was all right. I never forgot that. The first really big interview I did was with Harry Bridges, the legendary leader of the International Longshoremen's Warehousemen's Union. And Harry was this amazing little, I think he was about 5'1", this Aussie who had been, although he denied that roundly, they kept trying to deport him year after year, a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And he told me I came up to him at the Aberdeen Longshore picnic, and I was stationed between two charter members of the ILWU. And Harry came up, put an arm around each one, took a bite out of a hot dog, and said, "We've seen some days, ain't we, mates?" And I used that as a lead for my story. And I always thought, if I had only had the prescience or the time to sit down and interview Harry, because he told me that Grace Harbor always felt like home to him. It was the ILWU union local on Grace Harbor was the second in the ILWU. The next week, after interviewing Harry Bridges, I get sent to cover a press conference featuring Henry M. Jackson talking on the Vietnam War in McClary, of all places. It was pretty amazing. And then they sent me off to Olympia to cover the legislature 3 days a week. And let me tell you, in 1967, every newspaper in the state, from the Columbia Basin Herald at Moses Lake to the Daily World at Aberdeen to the Columbian Port Angeles, had somebody at least covering the legislature 2 or 3 days a week or plucking out good feature stories. And then there was a platoon of University of Washington journalism students who augmented that. The first person I met was Adele Ferguson. If you know anything about Adele, she was bigger than life was invented for her. She was brassy and tough, and God, could she write. She pulled off the trick of being able to cover straight journalism during the day and then write a column 2 or 3 days a week and maintain the respect of people who knew that she was able to divorce opinion from straight news coverage. No mean trick, and you couldn't do it today. I also met the whole retinue of Dan Evans's bushy-tailed young progressive Republicans, Slade Gorton, Joel Pritchard, Mary Ellen McCaffrey, and the best storyteller was Sid Snyder, who was the Deputy Secretary of the State Senate. And if any of you knew Sid, who went on to become a distinguished state senator and parlayed a little grocery store at Long Beach into a multi-million-dollar business. He was just an inimitable person. When I look back on my 43 years as a newspaperman, my major regret is that I never had the time to flesh out those stories, whether it was Harry or whomever. And I could fill an hour, or a lot longer, with stories of my failures and misgivings, including some potentially great oral histories I never took the time to record in my own family. A pretty amazing group of Dust Bowl refugees, largely Welsh, Scottish extraction, who love to sing and dance and drink and have a good time and talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie. But here's my message. We are all oral historians. You are all oral historians. You have to be oral historians. You owe it to posterity, to your families, to the broader sense of Washington state history, and just your psychic well-being to share stories. I love what we're doing on TV with Dr. Gates and tracing your roots and all the genealogy-based stories, because a lot of stories that were family secrets, some not very palatable, are coming out of the closet. They're cathartic, they're enriching, and they, in places where the stories aren't so appetizing, they dispel any of those linger things about people being born out of wedlock or messy divorces or bipolar. I mean, it's really remarkable. So Marvin Frost, my uncle, said, "We're burning daylight." How many of you know a World War II veteran? Could you raise your hands? Are there any World War II veterans here? Well, that's fitting. Maybe not fitting, but that I sort of italicize what I'm saying. 16 million Americans served during World War II, and as of January 1st, approximately 496,000 were still alive. By tomorrow, 492 of those people will have died. And the pace is quickening too for Korean War veterans and even Vietnam War veterans. People of my age and now in their 70s, well, the youngest of us who remember Vietnam really well were in our 60s when the war ended. We're serving in the war, being caught up in the protests at home or supporting our troops. It was just a remarkable era. It's hard to believe, as we tell in this book, the things that happened in 1968. The assassination of Dr. King, a few weeks later, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, to whom it fell, standing on the back of a flatbed truck, breaking the news to an audience largely of African Americans that Dr. King had been killed, telling the story that he could understand because a white man killed his brother too, and appealing for calm. Tragically, it didn't work. Rioting broke out across America. Lyndon Johnson went on TV and memorably said he would not accept nor seek nor accept the nomination of his party for another term as your president. It's a whole generation of stories there. Norm Dix, Congressman Dix, Karen Frazier, I mean, they're just such resonating stories about what a time it was. Another guy from Grace Harbor, one of the top pollsters in America, Stuart Elway, was interviewed, and the crucible of the 1960s was what taught him a lot about public opinion and how to accurately tap it. So, there are any number of boring books about doing oral history. We have 3 of them on our shelf. They're just terrible. They truly are. And so here's what you really need to know. Buy a good tape recorder. Okay. I used the Panasonic, the Olympus D8 2300. The first tape recorder we bought for $55. Works like a charm. All these stories. So buy a good tape recorder, do your homework, make sure you know how to use it. That's really important. And then the most important thing is when you get the interview, try to untangle the mic cords. I don't know what, it's like the extension cord for the heating pad. How does it work? There's little batteries that go in these, that fire the little lapel mics. And you need some of those. These the little watch crystal things. And then, every time I give an oral history talk, I always say, and finally, the most important thing about the art of doing oral history is this: take extra batteries. Because if you look down, the disc read error is one thing, but if you look down and the damn thing is out of juice, that's just as disheartening. Okay. So once you have a reliable tape recorder that you know how to use and you have extra batteries for the main tape recorder and the lapel mics, do your homework. I had a really neat experience years ago. I was invited because I knew Medal of Honor winner Robert Bush of South Bend, the founder of the Bayview Lumber Company stores. Bob had won the Medal of Honor, or received rather. We don't win the Medal of Honor. We received the Medal of Honor as an 18-year-old medical corpsman on Okinawa in the Battle of Okinawa. Tom Brokaw was starting out on the book that became The Greatest Generation and came to interview Bob in Elma. And Bob invited me to be there. And you know what? Tom Brokaw, besides being ridiculously handsome and urbane, turned out to be a really nice guy, a genuinely down-to-earth guy, and his crew told me something important, that he'd done his own homework, his own research, and he knew his stuff. He knew the Battle of Okinawa backwards and forwards. And I was really impressed by that. He listened intently. He asked great follow-up questions. You know, you don't have to fake it. This is not stagecraft. But when you're interviewing someone, whether it's a 90-year-old nervous black lady from Bremerton who already is really antsy about what this is going to lead to, lean forward intently, listen, show someone you really care. It really matters. And then if you've done your homework, try to project warmth and empathy for the person. Try to make them feel comfortable. Find a place that's quiet, hopefully, where they're comfortable, you're comfortable. You don't want to interview somebody in the bingo hall at Our Lady of Good Help Catholic Church. That's not a good idea. You get background noise. In every intuitive oral historian knows, I guess after bring extra batteries, the really important rule is shut up and listen. Because if you've done your own homework, you might, and I have a problem with this, you might want to interject your own stories, but you need to let somebody talk, and then you can ask a follow-up question. Your state library, your Timberland library, college libraries, Evergreen has a really good library, and they'll let you use it. You're a taxpayer. There's just a trove of material on every subject, from the wars to the Depression to Northwest history. In particular, the Northwest history section at the Washington State Library is remarkable. You can Google for information, good source. You should Google your own name, I understand, all the time. It's kind of frightening to see what's there. When we give talks to Washington State history students, and a lot of highly capable students, as they say today, we always take pains to disabuse the kids of the notion that Wikipedia is always accurate. I mean, sites like historylink.org, run by my friend Marie McCaffrey, the Smithsonian and PBS are just excellent. The PBS documentaries are up there. I watched The Big Burn, Tim Egan's incredible piece, again the other night. I also watched an amazing piece about Native Americans and their contribution to rock and roll. Who knew that Robbie Robertson of the band is part Mohawk and part Jewish? I mean, it's fabulous. If you intend to publish an interview or share it widely through social media, be certain you obtain a release from the person. Explain to them what you want to do. I'd like to interview you. I'd like to have your permission to interview you. Here's what I intend to do with it. I may share it with only your friends at Panorama City. I may share it on Thurston Talk. I may in the Daily Olympian, whatever. And if you're collecting stories for a book, be certain, whether it's in print or online, obtain a signed release form. You can go the template from online from the Oral History Association and the Library of Congress. They're good. They've been vetted, and they'll serve you well. Prepare a script of the questions you like. You've done your homework. Now you've got a script. Talking points. Could be just bullet points. And above all, ask open-ended questions. A good example of a closed-ended question is this. Were you afraid when you heard the news that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor? The answer, as my kids would say, is duh. Yes, I was. I was afraid. And a good interviewer would ask it like this. Please tell me how old you were and exactly where you were when you heard the news on the date that will live in infamy, and how it felt to really process that we were now at war. Were you a youngster? Were you of draft age? Whatever. Asking people about landmark historic events is always good history, whether it's the JFK assassination or the moon landing or 9/11. When I asked former longtime state auditor Bob Graham, a really lovely man, where he was on December 7th, 1941, he related an absolutely remarkable story. He told me that a book first published in 1909 called The Valor of Ignorance predicted with eerie accuracy that Japan in the 1940s would attack the United States of America, launch a world war, an attack and a surprise attack, by the way, followed by an invasion of the West Coast, and that the likely spot for that would be the undefended beaches north and south of Grace Harbor. A lot of people read the book in 1909 and sort of shelved it aside as being, if not science fiction, a figment of somebody's imagination. A lot of those copies of that book got dusted off, and it was printed in a new edition on December 8th, 1941. Bob Graham was the student body president at Grace Harbor College that year. He lived at Copalis Crossing. If you know Grace Harbor, Copalis Crossing was then a main route, and today is still a quick way to get to Pacific Beach if you want to dig clams. Main route from Hoquiam to the North Beaches. Bob told me that one of his most vivid memories of December 8th was that night a convoy of trucks from Fort Lewis rumbled through the crossing en route to Pacific Beach to set up gun emplacements along the dunes. Some of those pillboxes are still out there, by the way, at Grayland and near Moclips. And he told me that his mom and other North Beach ladies took cookies and baked goods to the guys out there. Pretty lonely duty. Then I asked Jim Evans for the book we did on the Korean War, a Marine who served in Korea at the Chosin Reservoir, 32 degrees below zero. Pretty amazing. I asked what he was doing on December 7th, 1941, and he said the next day for him was also the most memorable. He was a 12-year-old on his bike, delivering newspapers along Simpson Avenue in Aberdeen, both sides, a route I had in the 1950s, and as darkness fell, he recalled blackout blinds being pulled house by house as he drove by and he made his rounds. And then he said this, it was as if the lights were going out all around my world. That whether you're Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Dodge, or John Hughes, those are the sorts of real-life stories that actually absolutely propel a narrative. And when we do oral histories, the old format of Q&A is good. That's a starting point. You need to transcribe what you've got. But pluck out those quotes, what we call the story that really makes the story come alive. Well, it's now time for my confessions. The most compelling burning daylight story of my whole career, my whole life, is really a cautionary tale for all of us. It features my uncle, Charles Edgar McSpadden, a Dust Bowl refugee who landed on Grace Harbor in 1934, following his sisters because they told him that, unlike most places, especially in the Midwest, you could still find a job in Grace Harbor. You'd never go hungry. You could dig clams. You could shoot deer. There were fish in the Chehalis River. You know why the Chehalis River is like a fish, though, don't you? There are fins on both sides. Yeah, it's an old joke. The true story. Okay. Well, I've been a professional storyteller now for 54 years, and it breaks my heart to share with you Uncle Charles. I think about him every day because he's portraits on our fireplace mantel. On December 7th, 1941, Charles E. McSpadden was working at the E.C. Miller Cedar Lumber Company in South Aberdeen. He enlisted in the Army right after the first of the year and was sent to aerial gunner school because he was a crack shot. His eye-hand coordination was absolutely extraordinary. He ended up with the 351st Bomb Squadron of the 100th Bomb Group at Thorpe Abbotts on the coast of England. That group was known as the Bloody 100th, and for good reason, because the losses it absorbed, particularly early in the war when the B-17s lacked fighter escorts, were just absolutely appalling. On its first mission in 1943, the group lost 3 planes and 30 men. Uncle Charles made it back. He was the old man of his air crew at 32, a waist gunner manning a machine gun, and flew 32 missions into the maw of the Third Reich. His flying fortress was called What I Care, painted on the nose. And I asked him what that really meant, and he said, after about the 15th mission, it really was what I care. I'm lucky to be alive. Well, Charles McSpadden was a soft-spoken sawmill man with a high school education from Aberdeen, Washington, and he lived to tell about all that. He was one of the ones who made it back, came back to Aberdeen, got a job on the railroad. I am his namesake. I'm John Charles Hughes. I've really been proud of that. I'm the only son of his beloved kid sister, and there's a great photo of him home on leave before he was sent to England, and I'm the 1-year-old in his long arms. I love that picture too. Well, my parents divorced at War's End. Felt like World's End. My parents divorced at War's End, and I never really knew my father. In fact, I only met him once when I was an 18-year-old at Lackland Air Force Base in basic training, and he was the deputy base commander. It was not a good relationship between my mother and father. My Uncle Charles, on the other hand, was the dominant male figure in my life. He was tall and lean and a wonderful storyteller, except he didn't want to tell his war stories to me, at least. Growing up in the 1950s, probably like many of the men in this room of my age, I was one of those kids who built Revell plastic model airplanes and sometimes balsa wood airplanes if we learned not to open an artery with an X-Acto knife. I carefully assembled a plastic Revell B-17 in 1954, applied the appropriate decals, showed it to my uncle, and said, "Tell me all about it." Pretty good open-ended question, actually. There's not much to tell, he said. I was lucky. That's pretty much it. It's not a pretty story. Fast forward to 2000. I got a lot better at asking questions. The Sentimental Journey, one of the last airworthy B-17s existent, stopped at Hoquiam's Bowerman Field for the 4th of July. When the news release arrived in the newsroom that day, it was clear who got to take the free flight, and that would be the editor, not the reporter. I took a ride. I'll never forget. I started out in the waist gunner's position, and the doors were open, so you're in the airstream. And then I got to go down front where the bombardier sat, and we were skimming the waves from Hoquiam to Astoria and back. I wish that I'd been able to bomb Walmart on the way past, but no such luck. I wrote a column. The column ended up winning an award. I was really proud of that one. But that was on a Saturday. On Sunday, I called my Uncle Charles, who was living in Gresham, Oregon, and I said that the B-17's next stop was at Troutdale, practically in his backyard. I'd pay for his trip, $250, the best dollars I'd ever spent. He just had to do it. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay. I was in my office a week later, and I got a call. It was my Uncle Charles, and he was laughing. He was not a real funny guy. So I took this to be a really good sign. I said, God, it must have been great to go flying that old bird again for the first time in 57 years. Tell me all about it, I said, asking a good open-ended question. Well, he said, I'm in the emergency room. During the war, I never had so much as a bloody nose, but I sprained my ankle getting out of that airplane. It hurts like hell, but I had a wonderful time, and I want to thank you. Well, that happily broke the ice for war stories. Yet I never took the time to record them. Didn't have the time. Pretty stupid. One of the best And this is really tells you what you'll find in oral history when you ask open-ended questions and you get people to talk. One of the best stories that he told me is a war story that you've never heard before, I guarantee it. It revolves around bodily functions in combat. Who's written a book about that? B-17 fuselages were unpressurized. At bombing height, it was well below zero up there in an unpressurized cabin. So you knew if you were on a B-17 aircrew, before you left the coast of England, you'd better use the latrine because altitudes and freezing temperatures could play havoc with your bowels and your bladder. Doing number 2 in an airplane in combat could be really tedious, hazardous to your health. For number 1, there was what, and I looked this up, and you can go online. For number 1, there was a relief tube. And a relief tube was like a rubber hose with kind of a funnel on the top, which one tried to avoid having to use for obvious reasons. But Uncle Charles said that on one memorable mission, he absolutely, positively had, as he put it, had to take a leak. It felt like his bladder was about to explode. And with considerable difficulty, he got himself out of his sheepskin-lined flying pants, unbuttoned his fly, and positioned himself in the tube. And when he did, the skin of his privates, as he put it, froze to the tube. This is sort of the World War II equivalent of licking a frozen flagpole. Yeah. I told this story to I'm the father of, I lived with 3 women for 18 years, 2 daughters and a wife. And when I told them this story, that they'd always envy, they always said it was so much easier for boys to go to the bathroom. And they grimaced along with me. And the other gunner, the left waist gunner, came to Uncle Charles's rescue with the remainder of the coffee they had in a thermos. Gosh is right. Yeah. God. Thankfully, he said it was lukewarm by then, and he was, so. The rest of the story is not as happy. Uncle Charles died a year later, a few days short of 90. When I called the Air National Guard Reserve at Portland International Airport and told them that someone who had been a member of the Bloody 100th had just died at 90, they sent the sharpest honor guard I've ever seen, with a handsome young spit-polished captain leading him at the National Cemetery. And back at his house after the funeral, Uncle Charles's stepdaughter said he had left some things for me and my cousin. Arrayed on his bed were 4 air medals, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, his aircrew gunner's wings, these here, and a priceless mission diary. Now, for those of you who know about World War II history and aviation, an authentic mission diary of those 32 missions is pretty remarkable stuff. I've since shared it with the 8th Air Force Historical Association, and they were really grateful to have it, detailing flak, numbers of flighters, and counted how many planes lost, elapsed time. Well, the wings in the diary became mine, and my cousin scooped up the rest. And a week later, something else arrived in the mail. His stepdaughter had discovered something in the back of Uncle Charles's closet that she wanted me to have, because I'd served in the Air Force too. I opened the large box with anticipation, with my daughters and my wife looking on, and I had a bona fide 1943 issue A2 flight jacket. Talk about a priceless artifact. I guess for some reason, maybe like a lot of you, I seem to cry more easily the older I get. But those wings make me tear up every time I look at them. They're right under his portrait. So here's my message to you. You're all oral historians. You likely have your own Uncle Charles, your Aunt Madge, your Uncle Bob, maybe a mom, a dad, or a grandpa with a story that needs to be preserved and shared. And you can do it. I have a book here, a terrific book. State Senator Hans Zeiger has a master's degree in political science, but he's a first-rate historian. He set out a few years ago after hearing a World War II veteran speak at a service club meeting in Puyallup, where he lives, and resolved that he was going to start recording oral histories. The result is Puyallup in World War II, which is first-class World War II memorabilia, the work of an oral historian, an instinctive oral historian. I really recommend it to you. Not only that, but Bill Lindstrom will tell you that the best thing about publishing today, back in the day, say 40 years ago, a friend of mine was Diane Ellison, a world champion female log roller from Grace Harbor. She wanted to publish a book about the exploits of her exploits and the exploits of her father, Russ Ellison, an Aberdeen automobile dealer who was a multiple-time world champion. She wrote a book, found a vanity publishing house, as we used to say, which means you're paying for yourself to have it published, and paid $22,000 to have not very many copies of that book printed. She ended up having to sell it for a king's ransom back then. Today, with Gorham, the publishing house that Bill's worked with and others, the quality of what John did, found an Uyghur publisher in Oregon State University. That can happen if you've got a really great story. 2 of ours have been picked up that way, with the University of Washington Press. But Gorham is a state-of-the-art publishing house. You will be surprised. I'm not here to be a walking commercial for them, but they have been as good as gold working with us. They can deliver to you a state-of-the-art book that will be at home at Barnes & Noble or any bookseller for a very reasonable cost, and also have a design staff and others to help you. So you have no excuse but to get out and do it. If you know somebody with an extraordinary story who's made an important contribution to the political history of Washington State, we certainly want to hear about it. We're working now on a project that we're really excited about. In 1910, the women of Washington got the vote 10 years before women nationwide. The 19th Amendment was not finally ratified until 1920. So these pioneering women suffragists, very determined ladies, club ladies, Women's Christian Temperance Union, DAR, university women, they're really some remarkable people. We hit on a project, and by the way, so the 100th anniversary of suffrage nationwide is in 2020. Washington women, to us, were ahead of the curve, quote unquote. We wanted to write about the women in Washington, extraordinary women who in various ways were pace setters. One is Josephine Corliss Preston, surprisingly about whom few have heard. She was a direct beneficiary of suffrage in Washington in 1910. In 1912, was elected the first ever female statewide elected official as your superintendent of public instruction. And over the next 16 years, she transformed Washington education into the modern era. Really a remarkable story. Really an honor to tell it. Bob Young is telling the story right now, working on the story of Elsie Parrish, a hotel chambermaid in Wenatchee, who in 1937 was the plaintiff in a legal case over fair employment practices that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court and resulted in a landmark victory for equal rights. We interviewed former Governor Chris Gregoire the other day to bring up to date the story of comparable worth in Washington State, the concept that there should be equal pay for men and women in comparable jobs. And it's hard to believe that as recently as 30 years ago, that was a landmark, hard-fought concept. But if you know of folks who fit in with that story, the story of suffrage or women being ahead of the curve pacemakers in Washington, we'd love to hear about it. We're going down the stretch and finalizing our subjects, but we'd like to know. And I would be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
Talking about 1968, you didn't mention, did you do anything on Art Fletcher?
I did a major piece on Art Fletcher, whom I covered on the campaign trail in 1968.
I went to the National Convention that year. I was 19 years old.
Where were you when I needed you? Why didn't I know about you?
As you know, his landmark stuff on all kinds of stuff coming out of the Tri-Cities as a councilman was incorporated into the Republican Party platform. And he was invited back, but he was lieutenant governor candidate, as you know, the Action for Washington group with Evans, Slade Gordon, etc., and was not elected. But talk about a watershed. First time a major political position had a candidate of color.
And narrowly defeated, by the way, because of racist screeds that were disseminated in eastern Washington by a right-wing Birch Society paper called The Eagle. You'll be really pleased to know that the longest chapter in this book is about Arthur Fletcher. And probably more pleased, as am I, that I worked with his biographer, a Midwest University historian who has a major biography, full-scale biography of Art coming out next year. And I hope that we can get him here to talk, because Art Fletcher, the might-have-beens there, are remarkable. After narrowly defeated for the office of lieutenant governor in the state of Washington that year, he went on to be the father of affirmative action for the Nixon administration.
A cabinet member, I guess an assistant deputy, I believe.
And a UN ambassador, you name it, a deputy ambassador under George H.W. Bush. Remarkable story. The great story about Art, I remember when I finally got to use, speaking of the first rough draft, I finally got to use something that Art had said to me on the campaign trail when I met him in 1968. The identifier for Art Fletcher, and it seems so antiquated when you read it in the newspapers today, he was always identified as the Negro East Pasco City Councilman. You know, Negro is part of your identity. And so when I met him, Art had just been described in the Seattle Times as, quote, an articulate Negro. And I said, Art, you're really coming up in the world. And he threw back. He's a big man, a former football player. Threw back his head. Must have been 6'4", 250. Threw back his head and he said, "Yes, we have very shiny teeth and we're musical." And it was just great. So yes, Art Fletcher's there.